By the time most people go to bed, they assume the birds in their yard have already shut off for the night. Tucked into a branch, eyes closed, nothing left to see until sunrise.
Midnight approaches in this quiet suburb. But tonight, silence is no guarantee of safety.
But there is one specific hour, every single night, somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m., when that assumption falls apart completely. In that hour, a sleeping songbird's brain produces the exact same electrical pattern it uses to sing out loud.
As night falls, the pond becomes a mirror. This sleeping mallard slowly drifts, completely at peace, drifting in a perfect midnight slumber.
A duck floating on a pond rotates its entire body and its entire attention without ever fully waking up.
In the dead of night, this tiny bird remains perfectly still. To survive, its body temperature drops dramatically.
A small brown bird barely the size of your thumb can lower its core temperature low enough that, by daylight standards, it would be mistaken for dead. None of this happens at dusk, when the birds are still settling in. None of it happens at dawn, when the first calls of the morning start. It happens specifically in the 1 hour after midnight, in the deepest, quietest part of the night.
At midnight, the backyard transforms. Hidden in plain sight, the birds are asleep.
And it is happening in your yard tonight. In the trees along your street.
Under the soft glow of the moon, the pond becomes a peaceful sanctuary, the haven from the world. Here, they will rest undisturbed until the morning light.
And on the pond at the edge of your town, whether you are awake to notice it or not, this isn't a fringe theory or a story passed between birdwatchers at a feeder. It is one of the most actively studied windows in nocturnal animal behavior.
Their heart rates have stabilized. Thermal feed is perfectly clear.
Remarkable energy conservation.
Let's keep monitoring.
And over the last 2 decades, researchers using infrared cameras, implanted muscle sensors, and electrodes placed directly into sleeping brains have documented behavior in this specific hour.
Using advanced infrared sensors, researchers can now monitor wildlife without ever disturbing their natural behavior.
That does not happen, in the same form, at any other point in the 24-hour cycle. Why this particular hour and not another is still partly an open question. But the leading explanation involves the layering of 2 separate clocks: a bird's circadian rhythm, which governs broad daily patterns of activity and rest, and a faster internal sleep cycle that moves through different depths of sleep multiple times each night. Researchers studying both systems have found that they appear to align most precisely in this narrow window after midnight, when the night is old enough that a bird's deepest recovery sleep is already past, but young enough that there are still several hours left before the body needs to start preparing for the demands of dawn. Welcome back to Bird Whisper. If you're new here, subscribe before you leave, because what we're about to walk through happens in almost every backyard, park, and wetland in North America. And once you understand it, the silence outside your window at midnight is going to sound very different to you. Today we're going hour by hour, almost minute by minute, through the 1 hour after midnight, watching 5 completely different things happen in 5 completely different places. From a tree branch, 20 feet from a house, to a pond 2 streets over, to a desert ledge 1,000 miles away, to the open sky 1,000 feet above your roof. Stay until the end, because the final one isn't simply a behavior that researchers observed and measured from a distance. It's a discovery that pushed one of the lead scientists involved to use a word in his published research that scientists almost never allow themselves to use about an animal's inner life. And once you hear what made him use it, And what the data actually showed, you will not think about your sleeping birds the same way again. Let's start at 12:08 a.m. with something as ordinary as a robin asleep in a maple tree. To anyone looking up from the ground, the bird is doing nothing at all. It is a still gray shape against the branches, head tucked back toward its shoulder, one foot drawn up into its feathers, completely motionless. But if you could attach a sensor to that robin's brain, the way researchers at institutions like the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology have done with several songbird species, you would see something that looks nothing like simple rest. For most of the night, a sleeping bird's brain produces slow, steady waves, the avian equivalent of deep, dreamless human sleep, the kind of sleep most people picture when they imagine an animal resting. But several times during the night, and disproportionately in the hour just after midnight, that pattern breaks apart completely. The brain shifts into rapid, irregular activity that closely resembles what happens in a human brain during REM sleep, the stage most strongly associated with dreaming. During these bursts, which usually last under a minute and sometimes only a handful of seconds, the robin's eyelids may flutter. Small twitches run through its leg and wing muscles, and in some recorded cases, the bird's tail feathers visibly jerk even though the bird never wakes, never loses its balance, and never loses its grip on the branch. Researchers studying this phenomenon, including work associated with the sleep scientist Niels Rapp, have found that these REM-like episodes are short in birds compared to mammals, often lasting only a fraction of the time a human REM cycle lasts, but that they cluster heavily in this midnight window rather than spreading evenly across the night the way scientists initially expected. No scientist will tell you with certainty that a robin in your yard is dreaming at 12:08 a.m. because no one has direct access to a bird's subjective experience, and that gap between observable brain activity and actual inner experience is one researchers are careful never to paper over. But the brain activity, the muscle twitches, and the precise, repeatable timing all map onto the same biological signature associated with dreaming in mammals. Something is happening behind that motionless silhouette in the tree, and it is happening on a schedule, concentrated specifically in the hour you assumed was the emptiest, quietest part of the night. Similar patterns have since been recorded in sparrows, finches, and several other small songbird species kept under controlled observation, with one consistent detail repeating across almost every study. The total amount of time any single bird spends in this REM-like state over an entire night is small, often adding up to only a few minutes in total, but the timing is never evenly distributed. It, bunches, and the heaviest single cluster, across species and across studies, keeps showing up in this same narrow stretch after midnight, as if the bird's nervous system is choosing this particular hour, out of 8 or 9 hours of darkness, to do whatever this activity is actually for. At 12:21 a.m., on the edge of a pond 2 streets over, a small group of mallards is floating in a tight raft, apparently asleep, drifting slightly with the current. But watch closely and you'll notice something birds on land almost never do. The ducks positioned on the outer edge of the group are sleeping with only one eye closed. The other eye stays open, fixed outward, scanning the dark water and the tree line beyond it without interruption. This is called unihemispheric sleep, half of the brain resting in deep sleep, while the other half stays measurably alert. And while several bird species use this ability occasionally throughout the day and night, researchers studying and related waterfowl have found that it becomes dramatically more common, and far more precisely directed, in this specific midnight hour, when predator activity along shorelines statistically tends to peak, roughly every 10 to 15 minutes. The entire raft performs something close to a rotation. The ducks on the perimeter, the ones doing the open-eyed watching, shuffled position with the ducks toward the center, who have been sleeping with both eyes fully closed and both hemispheres resting. The group rearranges itself, so the burden of vigilance is shared, almost like a shift schedule at a job none of them ever agreed to out loud, without a single duck ever fully waking to organize it or call the rotation. Research on sleeping mallards has found that birds positioned on the edges of the raft spend significantly more time in this single hemisphere sleep state than birds positioned safely in the center, and that the open eye was reliably oriented toward the direction a predator was statistically most likely to approach from. Based on shoreline geographies and known predator movement patterns at each study site, what looks like a random, drifting cluster of resting ducks at 12:21 a.m. is, in reality, a coordinated, rotating security system, one that resets and redistributes itself 4 to 6 separate times before sunrise, and does so without a single visible signal, call, or gesture passing between the birds involved. The threats this system is built around are not abstract. Raccoons, mink, and feral cats are all capable swimmers and competent shoreline hunters, and all three are disproportionately active in the hour or two after midnight, when human activity along a pond's edge has fully stopped and the area belongs entirely to nocturnal predators. Researchers comparing rafts of different sizes have also found that larger groups spend proportionally less individual time in this vigilant, single-eye state than smaller groups do, since the same level of overall protection can be maintained by rotating a smaller fraction of a bigger crowd, a pattern sometimes described as safety scaling with numbers, and one that gives every individual duck in a large raft slightly more total deep, fully restorative sleep across the night than a duck in a small, exposed group would get. At 12:34 a.m., in a rocky stretch of California chaparral, a common puerwil is tucked motionless under a ledge. And unlike the robin in the maple tree, this bird is not simply sleeping. On cold nights, puerwils are capable of entering a state of torpor so deep that, for decades, naturalists who stumbled across one assumed they had found a dead bird and walked away without a second look. In 1946, a naturalist named Edmund Yeager found a puerwil wedged into a rock crevice in the California desert, completely unresponsive, with no detectable pulse by hand and a body temperature barely above the temperature of the surrounding rock. It wasn't dead. It was in one of the deepest states of biological shutdown ever documented in a North American bird, a discovery that took years for the scientific community to fully accept. During this hour after midnight, when overnight temperatures hit their first major drop of the night, a puerwil entering torpor can lower its body temperature by more than 30 degrees Fahrenheit and reduce its metabolic rate to a small fraction of normal, conserving fat reserves it would otherwise burn through in a matter of hours of normal nighttime activity. Unlike the brief nocturnal torpor used by chickadees or hummingbirds, which can snap back to full alertness within a minute if disturbed by a predator or a sudden noise, a puerwil in deep torpor can take far longer to rewarm and become responsive again. Sometimes most of an hour from the first sign of arousal to full flight readiness. For that entire window, the bird is, by almost every external measure available to a casual observer, indistinguishable from a corpse. Its eyes don't react to light. Its body doesn't respond to touch. Its breathing slows to the point that it can be difficult to detect without instruments. And yet, given enough time and a rise in ambient temperature, it returns, fully intact, to the same rock ledge it was using the night before, and the night before that. The common puerwil is the only North American bird confirmed to use torpor. This extreme across multiple consecutive nights, sometimes through entire cold spells, and the hour after midnight, when nighttime cooling accelerates, is consistently when researchers monitoring torpid puerwils have recorded the single deepest temperature readings of the night. According to some accounts from naturalists working with Hopi communities in the bird range, the puerwil was given a name that loosely translates to something like the sleeping one, a description rooted in direct REPEATED observation long before any electrode or thermometer confirmed what was actually happening underneath that ledge. Among warm-blooded animals generally, this kind of deep, multi-night torpor is far more commonly associated with small mammals, ground squirrels, certain bats, and hibernating rodents than with birds, which makes the puerwil something of an outlier even among its own torpor-capable relatives, like the chickadee and the hummingbird, at 12:47 a.m. In a stand of oaks at the edge of a suburban park, two eastern screech owls, a mated pair holding adjoining territory, begin calling back and forth across the dark. This is not the hunting behavior most people associate with owls. The sudden silent strike most nature documentaries focus on. It's something quieter, slower, and far less discussed. Researchers studying screech owl vocal behavior have found that mated pairs frequently engage in soft, overlapping duet calls during this specific midnight window. Calls too quiet and too brief to function as territorial warnings aimed at rival owls, and which instead seem to serve as a kind of contact check between two partners who are hunting separately in different parts of the same territory but staying continuously aware of each other's general location. One owl calls a short, descending sound. Within seconds, sometimes less, the other responds from a different point in the territory, often 50 to 100 yards away, close enough to hear clearly, but far enough that the two birds are clearly not hunting together. Neither bird moves toward the other after the exchange. The calling isn't about reuniting physically. It's about confirming, at a distance, that the partner is still present, still active, and still accounted for. In studies tracking paired owls through a season, researchers found that these midnight duets occurred far more reliably and more frequently during this specific hour than during the early evening, when both birds are just beginning to hunt, or just before dawn, when both are typically settling into a daytime roost. The clustering suggests the behavior functions almost like a schedule check-in built directly into the pair's nightly routine, a way of maintaining the pair bond and the shared territory without either bird sacrificing valuable hunting time to do it in person, to a person standing in their backyard at 12:47 a.m. It sounds like two owls, calling somewhere off in the dark, easy to dismiss as background noise. To the owls themselves, it's closer to two partners, quietly confirming, from a careful distance, that the night is proceeding exactly as expected. The frequency of these midnight duets shifts with the season, increasing noticeably in the weeks leading up to net, when maintaining a strong pair bond and a clearly defended territory becomes most important to a pair's eventual breeding success, and dropping off considerably outside that window, which is itself further evidence that the calls are doing real relationship and territory work, rather than simply being noise the birds happen to make at night out of habit. And nearly 1,000 feet above all of this, at 12:55 a.m., a Swainson's thrush that left a stopover site shortly after sunset is roughly at the midpoint of tonight's flight. several hours into a journey that will end well before dawn breaks over its next resting site. This is, biologically, the most demanding and most precarious moment of its entire night. Researchers tracking nocturnal migrants have found that birds rely on multiple navigation systems, simultaneously and continuously, throughout a long flight. A magnetic sense capable of detecting the Earth's field, recognizable patterns in the rotating night sky, and in some studies, polarized light observed and recorded at dusk that appears to be used to calibrate the other two systems against each other, before full darkness sets in. But those systems can drift slowly out of agreement with each other over the course of several hours of continuous flight, especially over regions with unusual local magnetic conditions, and the period around local midnight, the temporal middle of the night's journey, is when several independent studies have recorded migrating birds making small but consistently measurable course corrections, as though pausing to cross-check one system against another and quietly adjusting their heading. A bird relying too heavily on a magnetic reading that has shifted, even by a small margin, due to local geological interference, can drift meaningfully off its intended course over several more hours of unattended, unsupervised flight. The star compass, recalibrated against the slow, steady rotation of the night sky around the celestial pole, appears to function as the backup system migrating birds use to detect and correct that drift. And the correction itself tends to cluster around this same midpoint window, when there is still enough remaining night to act usefully on the adjustment. But enough flight time has already passed for any accumulated error to have become large enough to matter. The thrush passing silently over your house at 12:55 a.m. isn't simply flying in a straight line through the dark towards some fixed point. At this exact point in its journey, it is actively running a kind of internal audit of its own position, and the hour after midnight is consistently, repeatedly, when that audit happens. Researchers using weather radar to track these corrections have noted that they often coincide with small, brief changes in flight altitude as well. The bird climbing or descending by 100 feet or more for a short stretch, possibly to get a clearer, less obstructed view of the star field it relies on for the correction. None of this is free. Every adjustment, every minor change in heading or altitude, costs the thrush a measurable amount of the limited fat reserve it is burning through to make the entire overnight crossing, which means the bird is, in this single hour, weighing the cost of a small course correction now against the much larger cost of arriving badly off course later, and consistently choosing to pay the smaller price. All five of these things, the dreaming-like brain activity in the robin, the rotating watch system in the ducks, the radical metabolic shutdown in the pueo, the quiet long-distance check-in between the owls, and the mid-flight course correction in the thrush, are strange enough entirely on their own. Each one, by itself, would be enough to change how you think about the hour after midnight. But there is a sixth thing that happens in this same window, in a much smaller, much more ordinary bird than any of the ones we've covered so far. And when researchers first documented it in careful detail, it didn't just surprise them. It made them choose their words very, very carefully in print, because the most accurate explanation of what they were seeing sounded uncomfortably close to something out of fiction. In the year 2000, a team at the University of Chicago led by Daniel Margoliash and a researcher named Amish Dave published a study on zebrafinch, a small, common songbird, frequently kept in research labs, precisely because their singing behavior is so well documented and so well understood by neuroscientists. Young male zebra finches learn their adult song roughly the way a human infant learns to speak, by listening closely to an adult, attempting an imperfect early version of their own, and gradually refining that attempt through repetition over weeks and months. For a long time, researchers assumed that refinement happened almost entirely during waking hours, the bird singing out loud, hearing its own imperfect attempt, and making small real-time adjustments based on what it heard. But when Margoliash's team implanted fine electrodes into the specific brain regions responsible for generating song and record it, continuously through full nights of sleep, they found something nobody had expected to see. During sleep, in short, repeated bursts scattered through the night. The same neurons that fire when a zebra finch sings out loud during the day fired again, in almost the same sequence and almost the same relative timing, with no sound coming out at all. The bird's brain was, in effect, running the song internally, not some vague, generalized, simplified pattern, but the actual structured, individual specific sequence belonging to that one bird's own unique song, replayed quietly inside its head, while its body lay still on the perch. In some of the recordings, the tiny muscles controlling the vocal organ moved just enough to produce a faint, barely audible version of the song, so quiet that a person standing a few feet away in the dark would dismiss it as nothing more than a small rustle, a tiny mumbled fragment that meant nothing. Later research building directly on this original 2000 discovery found that these internal replay events happen in scattered bursts across the night, but appear with noticeably greater frequency in this same hour after midnight, precisely when slow, steady sleep periodically breaks into the same irregular, REM-like brain activity researchers had already been recording in other species, including the robin we started this video with. The pattern of replay wasn't perfectly identical from one burst to the next either. On some nights, the internally replayed song came out very slightly faster than the bird's daytime version. On other nights, slightly slower, with small variations in which syllables were emphasized, as though the bird wasn't simply replaying a fixed, frozen recording stored away somewhere in its brain, but actively adjusting it, testing small variations against each other, refining something in real time while completely unconscious. When Daniel Margoliash described the broader implications of this finding to other researchers and to the public, he reached for a sentence that scientists rarely allow themselves to write about an animal's internal experience without significant hedging. Based on the data his team had collected, he suggested it genuinely looked as though the zebra finch was, in some real and functional sense, dreaming of its own song, not as a loose metaphor for unconscious processing. Structurally, the same neural circuitry, activated in the same order, producing the same motor output, replaying itself with no audience, no daylight, and apparently no immediate purpose beyond whatever process is happening inside a small animal's brain while it sleeps in the dark. Later studies expanding on this work, in zebra finches, and in a handful of other songbird species since, have been careful to note that none of this proves birds experience dreams in the rich, narrative way humans describe their own dreams the next morning. And that subjective experience in any non-human animal remains something science still cannot measure directly, no matter how precise the electrodes get. That caution matters, and researchers in this field repeat it constantly, almost as a kind of professional discipline, but the behavior itself, a structured, individual-specific motor sequence replaying spontaneously during sleep, occasionally audible to a careful listener, almost always clustering inside this same hour after midnight, is not in dispute among the scientists who study it. It has been recorded, independently confirmed, and built upon by multiple research teams in the years since that first 2000 paper, and it remains one of the strongest pieces of physical evidence anyone has ever gathered that something resembling rehearsal, and possibly something resembling a dream, is taking place inside a bird's mind while its body looks to anyone glancing out a window, completely and totally still. Researchers have since gone looking for the same kind of internal replay in other songbirds beyond the zebra finch, and in several cases, they have found versions of it. Some studies on canaries, a species also known for a complex, learned song, have reported similar bursts of song-related neural activity during sleep, again concentrated more heavily in the hour or two after midnight than spread evenly through the night. The details differ from species to species, how strong the pattern is, how often it shows up, how closely it matches the daytime song. But the broad shape of the finding keeps repeating wherever scientists have looked closely enough to test for it. A small, ordinary songbird, asleep on a branch in the dark, running its own song through its brain for no audience at all, has gone from a single surprising result in one lab to a pattern researchers now expect to find almost anywhere they check. So somewhere out there tonight, in the hour after midnight, while you are almost certainly asleep yourself, a small brown bird in a backyard thicket or a quiet research aviary is silently rehearsing the exact song it sang out loud yesterday afternoon, with no one listening, for a reason no one can fully explain. A duck floating on a nearby pond is rotating its watch shift with the rest of its raft. A poor wheel tucked under a desert ledge is lying in a state so close to death it would fool a trained observer standing directly over it. Two screech owls 100 yards apart are confirming, from a careful distance, that the night is going exactly according to plan. And somewhere overhead, completely invisible in the dark, a bird the size of your closed fist is quietly double-checking its own position against the slow rotation of the stars. None of this happens in daylight. None of it is visible from your window, no matter how closely you look. It is happening on a fixed, repeatable schedule. Inside a narrow window most people sleep straight through for their entire lives, in the exact yards and trees and stretches of open sky surrounding the houses where they live, every single night, without exception. The next time you wake at midnight and hear nothing at all outside, remember that nothing is exactly what it looks like from where you're standing in your kitchen with the lights off. It is not nothing. It's the 1 hour when birds stop behaving like the birds you think you know, and start doing something far stranger, far more deliberate, and far closer to home than almost anyone realizes. You will probably never see any of it directly. You don't need to. It is enough to know that it is happening, on schedule, every single night, in the dark, just outside your door, long after you have stopped paying attention. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been awake in that hour after midnight and heard or noticed something outside that you couldn't fully explain at the time? I want to hear about it. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next one.